Daniel Reeves was not a soldier. He was not a hero either. He was simply an engineer, someone who liked machines more than people. His work on the edge of the galaxy usually kept him inside workshops, fixing broken energy couplers, repairing defense turrets, or patching the colony's failing power grid. Most days were quiet, filled with buzzing tools and glowing circuits. But everything changed the day he first met Kareth. The colony had signed a defensive treaty with an alien race called the Vayari. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and powerful. Their language was harsh, filled with low rumbles, deep tones, and growls that made even the bravest humans tense up. The Vayari were warriors by blood, raised to see strength in every action and weakness as shame. When Daniel heard they would be working alongside the colony, he shrugged. He figured they would keep to themselves, but fate had a different plan. The first Growl, Daniel was carrying a box of tools toward the outer gates when he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, steady, purposeful. When he turned, his eyes widened. There she was, Kareth. She stood taller than him by a full head, her shoulders broad, her body covered in armor marked with scars from battles he could not imagine. Her skin had a faint silver sheen, her dark eyes sharp as blades. Her every movement seemed like a threat, like she was born for combat. And then she growled. It was a low rumbling sound like a predator warning prey to stay back. The growl vibrated in his chest enough to make him pause with wide eyes. Most people would have frozen in fear or hurried away, but Daniel, for reasons even he could not explain, smiled nervously and said, "That's actually kind of cute." The word slipped out before he could stop himself. His brain screamed at him to shut up, but his mouth betrayed him. For a moment there was silence. Kareth's growl cut short. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in confusion. No one in her entire life had ever called her growling cute. Her people called it terrifying. Her enemies called it horrifying. And this small, fragile human called it cute? Daniel braced himself. He expected her to attack, or at least shout. Instead, she just stared at him as though trying to understand a puzzle she had never faced before. Confusion. "Human," she said at last, her voice like thunder. "Do you mock me?" Daniel swallowed hard. "No, I mean it. It was, I don't know, different, not scary, kinda charming." Kareth blinked, her warrior mask cracking with something close to disbelief. For the first time in her life, someone had not been afraid of her growl. Instead, he had smiled at it. She did not know whether to feel insulted or curious. She stepped closer, towering over him. Daniel forced himself not to step back, even though every instinct screamed that he should. He was painfully aware that if she wanted, she could crush him like an empty canister. "What is your name, human?" she demanded. "Daniel," he replied, quickly adjusting the toolbox in his arms. "Kareth," she said, placing one hand on her chest with pride. Her growl slipped again, not as a warning this time, but as a test. Daniel smiled weakly. "Still cute." Kareth froze. A seed of curiosity. That day, Daniel thought the encounter would be forgotten, but it was not. From that moment on, whenever he passed by the training grounds or the gates, he felt Kareth's eyes on him. She growled whenever he came near, not the same threatening growl as before, but shorter, sharper, like she was testing his reaction. And every time Daniel laughed or smiled. At first, the other colonists thought he had lost his mind. "You don't tease a Vayari warrior," one of them whispered. "Their growl is a challenge. You're playing with fire." But Daniel couldn't help it. Something about Kareth's growl did not feel like danger anymore. It felt alive. Meanwhile, Kareth herself was confused. Her people growled to assert dominance, to make others submit. But Daniel refused to submit. Instead, he looked at her like she was not a monster, but something interesting, something worth smiling at. For the first time in her warrior life, she found herself unsettled, not by fear, but by curiosity. The second meeting. A week later, Daniel was repairing a defense turret on the outer wall. The sun was low, painting the sky in red and gold. He heard the familiar heavy footsteps again, and before turning, he already knew who it was. "Hello, Kareth," he said casually, tightening a bolt with his wrench. "Human Daniel," she answered, her voice deep but steadier this time. She growled again. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, grinning. "Still cute?" This time she did not look confused. She looked amused. Her lips curved in a way that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell. "Do you always call danger cute?" she asked. "Only when danger sounds like a purring engine," Daniel replied, tapping the side of the turret. Kareth tilted her head again. She could not decide if he was brave or foolish. Perhaps both. A clash of worlds, their conversation was short, but it sparked something. Daniel began to see her more often, sometimes watching over patrols, sometimes standing guard, sometimes just walking through the colony. And every time she growled. Every time he smiled. The colonists whispered about it. Some laughed, some shook their heads, and some worried that Daniel was inviting trouble. But Daniel didn't care. For once, he was not just the quiet engineer in the corner. He had caught the attention of a warrior from another world. And Kareth, though she would not admit it, began to feel anticipation whenever she saw him. She did not understand why. She only knew that his strange human reaction to her growl made her think of him more than she should. The beginning of something strange one evening. Daniel returned to his quarters, exhausted from repairing the colony's generators. As he set down his tools, he heard a familiar sound outside the door. A low, steady growl. He opened the door and found Kareth standing there, arms crossed, eyes sharp as always. "Kareth?" he asked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she growled again, softer this time, almost like a habit. Daniel chuckled. "You really don't get tired of that, do you?" Kareth studied him silently, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "Human Daniel, you are strange. No one else calls my growl. This word, cute." Daniel shrugged. "Guess no one else hears it the way I do." For a moment, Kareth's stern face softened just slightly. She turned away, muttering something in her own language. Then, without another word, she walked off into the night. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, smiling to himself. He didn't know what this odd connection meant, but he knew one thing. His life on the colony was no longer ordinary. Daniel Reeves thought his days would always follow the same rhythm: machines, repairs, and quiet meals alone. But ever since he had called Kareth's growl cute, life had grown strange. Everywhere he went, she was there. If he was fixing a power conduit, she would appear nearby, arms crossed, watching with those sharp, dark eyes. If he entered the canteen, she would already be sitting in the corner, and as soon as he walked through the door, the familiar low growl would sound. Even when he walked across the colony yard at night, he could sometimes hear her behind him, her growl echoing softly like a shadow that followed him. At first, Daniel thought it was intimidation, but over time, he realized it was something else. Kareth was testing him. Each growl was not a warning anymore. It was a question. A question she seemed eager for him to answer, and every time he gave the same reply with a grin. Still cute. Curiosity and habit. One morning, Daniel was working inside the workshop, repairing a damaged plasma coil. The door hissed open, and he didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. "Morning, Kareth," he said. A growl rumbled through the air. "Still cute," Daniel replied automatically. He could hear the clink of her armor as she stepped inside. "You answer before even hearing the sound," she said, her voice filled with both amusement and disbelief. Daniel looked up from his tools. "It's kind of a habit now." "Strange human." "You keep saying that," Daniel replied, wiping grease from his hands. "But you keep showing up, so maybe I'm not the only strange one here." For the first time since they had met, Kareth laughed, a short, rough sound, like a bark. It startled Daniel so much that he almost dropped his tool. Her people rarely laughed, especially warriors. But somehow Daniel's words always cut through her shield of pride. Learning each other in the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Daniel and Kareth started talking. not just about Growls, but about their worlds. She told him about the Vayari homeworld, where mountains stretched into the clouds, and storms rolled across plains for weeks without stopping. She explained how her people were raised, warriors trained from childhood, taught to fight before they could even read. A Vayari's first growl as a child was considered a sign of future strength. Daniel, in turn, told her about Earth. He described forests, oceans, music, and laughter. He explained how humans were not born warriors, but dreamers, inventors, and survivors in their own way. Kareth listened carefully. Though she sometimes scoffed at the idea of humans being strong, she could not deny her growing respect for Daniel's creativity. His people had no claws, no armor, no great size, yet they had traveled the stars. That, in her eyes, was its own kind of strength. The spark of trust one afternoon. Daniel was called to repair one of the Vayari's armored transports. The vehicle had taken damage during a patrol, and its power system refused to restart. When he arrived, several Vayari warriors stood nearby, muttering among themselves. They did not like humans touching their machines, but their own mechanics had failed to fix it. Kareth was there too, watching. Daniel inspected the core, pulling out a cracked energy stabilizer. "This part is useless," he explained. "But I can patch it with a human converter until you get a replacement." One of the warriors snorted. "Human tricks, weak metal, weak tools, it will break." Daniel ignored the insult and got to work. He carefully rerouted the wires, adjusted the flow regulator, and attached a stabilizer of his own design. After 30 minutes, the transport hummed to life, its engine roaring stronger than before. The warriors stared in silence. Kareth stepped forward, her eyes on Daniel. She growled, not as a challenge but as a sign of approval. Daniel grinned. "Cute and grateful, I'll take it." Kareth shook her head, half in disbelief, half in amusement. But inside, she felt something shift. Daniel was not just a curious human anymore. He was useful, clever, reliable, someone she could trust. A strange reputation. As days turned into weeks, people across the colony noticed the odd bond between Daniel and Kareth. Whenever he entered a room, she growled. Whenever she growled, he smiled. It became a routine that no one understood. Some humans teased him. "Careful, Reeves," one of them joked. "She might be planning to eat you." Others whispered in awe. "He's the only human who stands up to a Vayari and lives." The Vayari warriors were less amused. To them, growling was sacred, a sign of power. To see one of their fiercest warriors growling at a human, and to see him treat it like a joke, was unthinkable. But Kareth ignored their disapproval. For reasons she could not fully explain, Daniel's presence made her feel different. Not weak, but alive. Not insulted, but noticed. A walk under the stars one. Quiet evening, Daniel was walking along the outer wall, staring at the stars. He liked to count them, wondering which ones had planets like Earth. Kareth joined him, her footsteps heavy but steady. She growled softly. "Cute," Daniel said automatically. "You always say the same word," she remarked. "Do humans have no other sounds for this?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Adorable? Charming? Endearing?" Kareth frowned. "Strange words? I do not understand them." Daniel chuckled. "Then stick with cute." "It means I like it." Kareth's eyes narrowed. "You like my growl?" "Yes," Daniel said honestly. "Because it means you're here." For the first time, Kareth had no answer. She looked up at the stars, her chest tight with an unfamiliar feeling, testing limits. The next day, Kareth decided to test him further. During a training session, she invited Daniel to watch. The Vayari warriors sparred fiercely, their blades flashing, their growls echoing across the yard. Daniel watched with wide eyes, impressed by their speed and strength. When it was Kareth's turn, she fought like a storm. Her opponent, a massive warrior, struck hard, but she struck harder. Every blow was met with a growl, every strike a roar of power. Finally, she disarmed her opponent and stood tall, victorious. Then she turned to Daniel. She growled louder than ever before, the sound shaking the ground beneath his feet. The other warriors expected him to cower, but Daniel, heart racing, smiled and clapped. Cute. And terrifying, but mostly cute. The Vayari warriors muttered angrily, but Kareth only stared at him. His words, so foolish yet so fearless, filled her with something she could not name. The bond deepens after that day. Kareth began seeking him out more often, not to intimidate him, but to talk. They shared meals, though she preferred heavy meats while he stuck to simpler food. They exchanged stories, jokes, and questions about each other's species. One evening, Daniel showed her how humans played music. He built a small device that hummed with soft melodies. Kareth tilted her head, listening with fascination. Her people had war chants, but nothing like this gentle, flowing sound. It feels different, she admitted. Like a growl without anger. Daniel smiled. Music is like emotions turned into sound. Humans use it to share what words cannot say. Kareth growled softly, not in challenge, but in thought. Daniel chuckled. Yep, still cute. This time she did not protest. She simply sat beside him, listening to the music under the quiet night sky. A silent question. One night, as Daniel returned to his quarters, he found Kareth already waiting outside his door. She growled, softer than ever, almost like a whisper. Daniel leaned against the wall. Still cute, he said with a gentle smile. Kareth studied him for a long moment. Then she asked, Why do you never fear me? Daniel hesitated. Because I don't see you as a monster. I see you as Kareth. Her chest tightened again, that strange, unfamiliar feeling returning. She had faced countless battles, survived wounds, and fought enemies without fear. Yet, this one human's simple words shook her more than any weapon. She growled again, not to test him, not to scare him, but simply because she wanted him to hear it. And as always, he answered with warmth. Still cute? The colony had lived in uneasy peace for months. Humans and Vayari warriors worked side by side, though never without tension. The Vayari saw themselves as protectors, the strong shields of the weak human settlers. The humans, while grateful, often felt insulted by the Vayari's pride. Daniel Reeves stayed in the middle of it all, fixing machines, patching systems, and somehow becoming a strange friend to Kareth, one of the fiercest Vayari warriors. But peace never lasted long. On the frontier, one night alarms blared across the colony. The sky lit up with streaks of fire as raider ships descended through the clouds. These were not Vayari allies, but a rival alien race. Marauders known for attacking undefended colonies, stealing resources, and leaving destruction behind. The humans panicked. The Vayari armed themselves, and Daniel, though not a soldier, found himself running toward the gates, tools clattering in his bag. The first attack. The raider ships hovered above the colony walls, releasing swarms of smaller craft. Energy bolts rained down, shaking the ground and shattering metal. Human guards fired back, but their weapons were weaker, their training less sharp. The Vayari roared to life. Kareth was at the front, her blade glowing with energy, her growl echoing across the battlefield like thunder. She moved with terrifying grace, cutting down enemies who dared to land near the walls. Daniel stayed back, heart pounding. He was no fighter, but he was an engineer, and engineers could fight in their own way. He rushed to the defense turrets, many of which were failing under the stress of the assault. Sparks flew from broken wires, and one cannon refused to turn. Daniel threw himself into the work, his fingers moving fast, patching, rewiring, and forcing the old machines to fight again. When one turret roared back to life, blasting a raider ship from the sky, Daniel grinned through the fear. That's more like it. From the corner of his eye, he saw Kareth fighting like a storm, her growl cutting through the chaos. And even in that moment of danger, Daniel couldn't stop himself from muttering, Still cute. Fighting side by side. The battle dragged on, for hours. The raiders kept pressing, and the colony walls shook with each blast. Daniel ran from one defense system to another, repairing, adjusting, improvising. He even pulled together traps, wiring explosives to hidden panels, rigging lights, to blind enemies, and redirecting energy through makeshift circuits. Kareth noticed. While she fought on the front lines, she saw Daniel darting between machines, unarmed, unarmored, but refusing to hide. His bravery was not the kind of strength her people respected, yet it was strength all the same. At one point, a raider broke through, rushing toward Daniel with a blade raised. Before Daniel could react, Kareth appeared, blocking the strike with her armored arm. She growled fiercely, her voice like a beast defending its territory. Daniel stared wide-eyed, then managed a weak smile. "Thanks, and, cute." Kareth nearly laughed mid-battle. The word still felt strange, but hearing it now gave her a surge of energy. She struck the raider down, her eyes burning with determination. Daniel's gamble, despite their efforts, the raiders' numbers were overwhelming. The colony gates cracked under pressure, and power across the defense grid began to fail. If the generators went down completely, the colony would be lost. Daniel knew what he had to do. He sprinted toward the main power core, a massive machine buried beneath the colony. Sparks flew as he slid inside, finding systems overheating, wires melting, and regulators on the edge of explosion. "This is bad, really bad," he muttered, sweat dripping down his forehead. Kareth burst into the chamber, blood and dust on her armor. "Daniel, the walls are falling." "I know," he shouted back, "but if I can reroute the core, we'll have one last surge for the defenses. It might hold them off long enough. Or it might destroy the colony," Kareth growled. Daniel looked up at her, eyes firm. "We don't have a choice." Kareth growled again, but this time it wasn't anger. It was fear disguised as strength. She had never cared what a human did before. But this human was different. "Then I will protect you," she said, planting herself at the doorway. Daniel's hands flew across the wires, his mind racing. He had to be faster than the raiders, faster than the failing systems. He cut connections, rerouted power, and used parts from his own toolkit to replace fried circuits. The ground shook as enemies pressed closer. Kareth roared and swung her blade, blocking any who tried to reach him. Finally, Daniel slammed the last switch. The lights flickered, then flared to life with blinding energy. Across the colony, defense turrets powered up, shields surged, and cannons unleashed a storm of fire. The raiders, unprepared for the sudden surge, began to retreat. Their ships pulled back into the sky, engines roaring as they fled. The colony was safe. Aftermath. When silence finally returned, the colony was in ruins. Buildings were scorched, walls broken, and the ground littered with debris. But the people were alive. The defense had held. Daniel collapsed against the power core, exhausted, his hands burned and shaking. Kareth stood over him, her blade dripping. With alien blood, her chest rising and falling heavily. "You are insane," she said at last. Daniel managed a weak laugh. "Yeah, but it worked." Kareth growled softly, not in anger this time, but in relief. Daniel smiled up at her. "Still cute." For once, Kareth did not argue. She simply lowered herself beside him, silent, her growl fading into something calm, whispers of doubt. The days after the battle were filled with rebuilding. Humans and Vayari worked together, patching walls and repairing damage. But whispers spread quickly. Some humans began to look at Kareth differently, noticing how often she stood near Daniel. Some Vayari warriors frowned when they saw her growling at him, not with challenge but with something else. To the Vayari, a warrior's growl was sacred, a sign of dominance. Yet she gave it to a human again and again, and the human answered, with a smile instead of fear. To them it looked like weakness. One evening, a Vayari commander approached Kareth. "You shame yourself," he said coldly. "You waste your growl on a fragile human who hides behind machines. You forget what it means to be Vayari." Kareth's hands tightened on her blade, but she said nothing. She knew his words reflected the thoughts of many. Yet when she thought of Daniel standing fearless among sparks and fire, she could not agree. Humans were fragile, yes, but Daniel was not weak. Kareth's realization. Late one night, Kareth stood on the walls, staring at the stars. She growled softly, almost to herself. "You okay?" Daniel's voice came from behind her. She turned. As always, his smile was calm, gentle, even after everything. "You should not stand near me," She muttered, "My people. They think I have grown weak. They think you make me less of a warrior." Daniel stepped closer, leaning against the wall beside her. "Do you think you're weaker?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I feel stronger, different, but I do not understand why." Daniel chuckled. "Maybe it's because strength isn't always about scaring people. Sometimes it's about protecting them. Sometimes it's about trust." Kareth looked at him, her chest heavy with that strange feeling again. Trust. The word lingered in her mind. She growled softly. Daniel grinned. "Still cute." And for the first time, Kareth let herself smile. The colony was quiet after the battle, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the silence that came after chaos, when everyone counted what was left. Walls were half destroyed, machines broken, and people shaken. The scars of the Raider attack would take months to heal. Daniel Reeves worked harder than ever. He rebuilt defense turrets, rewired power lines, and repaired energy systems. He rarely rested, moving from one broken place to another, carrying his box of tools like a soldier, carried a rifle. Kareth, meanwhile, stood watch over the colony. She patrolled the walls, trained younger warriors, and made sure the raiders would not dare return. But while she fought outside, she battled something else inside. Her people no longer looked at her the same way. Whispers among warriors. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Kareth entered the training yard. She expected her fellow Vayari to greet her with respect, as they once had. Instead, they fell silent. Whispers traveled through the group. Words like weakened, human lover, and unworthy. A younger warrior stepped forward boldly. "Why do you waste your growl on him?" he demanded. "Why do you lower your strength before a human who hides behind machines?" Kareth's eyes burned. Daniel is no coward. He faced the raiders, with no blade, no armor, and saved the colony with his mind. His strength is different, but it is real. The warrior scoffed. "You sound like him. Soon you will fight like him. Weak, fragile, hiding behind walls. You dishonor the Vayari name." Kareth growled, deep and powerful, silencing the yard. "Be careful, young one. Do not mistake my respect for weakness." The warrior stepped back, but the damage was done. The others still whispered, their eyes full of doubt. For the first time in her life, Kareth felt her honor slipping away, not because of defeat in battle, but because of her bond with a human. Distance, Daniel noticed. The change quickly. Kareth stopped visiting his workshop. She stopped waiting outside his quarters, stopped growling whenever he entered a room. At first, Daniel thought she was busy with her duties, but after days passed, he realized she was avoiding him. He found her on the walls one evening, her armor glinting in the moonlight. "Kareth," he called. She did not turn at first. When she finally looked at him, her face was unreadable. "You should not be here," she said. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? You bring me trouble," she interrupted. "My people doubt me because of you. They say I am weak. They say I forget who I am." Daniel's chest tightened. He had always known their bond was unusual, but hearing her speak so coldly stung. "I never wanted to cause you problems," he said quietly. Maybe it's better if I give you space." Kareth growled, but it was not the soft, curious growl he had grown used to. It was sharp, final, like a wall between them. Daniel nodded slowly, then turned and walked away. For the first time since they met, she did not stop him. The crisis days passed in silence. Daniel buried himself in work, fixing machines until his hands bled. Kareth focused on training and patrols, trying to silence the strange emptiness inside, but fate gave them no time to hide. One night, alarms rang again, not raiders this time, but something worse. The colony's central energy core, damaged during the attack, began to destabilize. If it failed, the explosion would wipe out everything for miles. Humans panicked. Vayari warriors tried to guard the facility, but none of them understood the machine. Daniel ran to the power station, his toolbox clattering at his side. He forced his way inside, coughing from the smoke of overheating wires. Sparks rained down as the core pulsed dangerously, each beat stronger than the last. This thing is going to blow, he muttered, his heart racing. Kareth's choice, Kareth, arrived moments later with several warriors. They stared at the unstable machine, unsure what to do. Fall back, one of them shouted. We cannot stop it. Evacuate the colony. But Kareth's eyes fell on Daniel. He was already inside, pulling wires, adjusting circuits, his face set with determination. Daniel, she shouted, get out. He shook his head, sweat pouring down his face. If I don't stabilize this, the colony is finished. You can run, but there'll be nothing to come back to. Her warriors grabbed her arm. Do not waste yourself for him. This is his madness. Let him die if he wishes. Kareth growled, deep and furious. Enough. He is stronger than any of you see. He is not madness. He is courage. The warriors stared, shocked. But Kareth tore free and rushed inside, standing guard at the doorway. Daniel looked up, startled. Kareth, what are you doing here? I said foolish words, she growled. I will not leave you. Do what you must, I will hold the line. Working together. The core shuddered, its glow blinding. Daniel moved faster than ever, his hands shaking from heat and stress. He barked instructions. Kareth, hold this valve. Open! If it closes, the whole thing overheats. Without hesitation, she slammed her armored hand on the valve, holding it with all her strength. Metal burned her skin, but she did not flinch. Now what? She growled through clenched teeth. Now, I reroute the regulators, Daniel replied, pulling wires and slamming a panel into place. Sparks exploded, burning his arm, but he kept going. The ground shook. Alarms screamed. Warriors outside shouted to retreat, but Kareth only growled louder, her voice echoing like thunder. Do not fail, human. Daniel gritted his teeth. I don't plan to. Finally, with one last surge, he slammed the final switch. The core's pulsing slowed, then steadied. Lights across the colony flickered back to normal. The danger was over. Daniel collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. Kareth released the valve. Her hand blistered and smoking, but she stood tall. They looked at each other, both shaking, both alive. The truth of strength. When they stepped outside, the warriors stared in silence. They had expected death. Instead, they saw the colony saved, not by warriors' blades, but by a human's mind and a Vayari's loyalty. One warrior muttered, impossible. Another whispered, she chose him. Kareth growled fiercely, silencing them. You call me weak because I stand with him. But tell me, was it weakness that saved this colony? Was it weakness that held the core when you all fled? The Bayir warriors lowered their heads. None dared answer. Daniel, exhausted, managed a smile. Still cute, he whispered. Kareth almost laughed, her chest tight with pride and something warmer. She placed her hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Strange, human, she said softly. A new bond that night. The colony was quiet again, but this time, it was not silence born of fear. It was silence born of survival, of respect. Humans and Vayari both looked at Daniel and Kareth differently. For Daniel, the emptiness he had felt when Kareth pulled away was gone. She had chosen to stand by him, even when her honor was questioned. For Kareth, the doubt in her heart had cleared. She no longer saw her bond with Daniel as weakness. She saw it as strength, the kind of strength her people had never known but desperately needed. As they walked back to the colony walls, Kareth growled. Softly, Daniel smiled. Still cute. This time she did not hide her laughter. The colony had survived 2 storms, raiders and the unstable core. For a while it felt like peace might finally stay. The walls were rebuilt, machines repaired, and humans and Vayari worked together more closely than before. But peace in the frontier was always fragile. Scouts returned one morning with grim news. The raiders were not finished. They were gathering again, this time with more ships, more weapons, and a determination to crush the colony once and for all. Fear spread quickly. Humans prepared to evacuate. Some Vayari suggested abandoning the settlement, but Daniel Reeves and Kareth knew there was no running. If the colony fell, hundreds of lives would be lost, and the dream of humans and Vayari building together would end. The calm. Before the storm, Daniel stood on the wall at sunrise, looking out at the empty horizon. His hands were rough with burns and scars, but he held his tools like a soldier held a blade. Kareth joined him, her armor polished, her blade glowing faintly. She growled softly, not fierce, not testing, just a reminder she was there. Daniel smiled. Still cute. She shook her head. You say this even now, before a great battle? Especially now, Daniel replied. Because I don't know what's coming. But if I hear your growl, I know I'm not alone. Kareth looked at him. For a long time, her chest heavy. For her people, a growl had always been about strength and dominance. But with him, it had become something else. It had become trust, preparing the defense. The colony had only days before the raiders' fleet arrived. Daniel worked without sleep, building traps, repairing weapons, and designing new systems. He turned broken parts into mines, rebuilt turrets, with scavenged power cells, and even rigged an old transport ship into a giant explosive, hidden outside the walls. Kareth trained the warriors, drilling them harder than ever. But this time she did not speak only of strength. She repeated Daniel's words about trust, about standing for each other. Some scoffed, but most listened. For the first time, humans and Vayari began to fight as one. At night, when others rested, Daniel and Kareth would meet on the wall. They spoke little, but the silence between them was not heavy. It was steady, like the calm heartbeat before battle. The invasion. The sky burned when the raiders came. Dozens of ships pierced the clouds, their engines howling, their weapons glowing, red. The ground shook as they unleashed fire upon the colony. But this time the defenders were ready. Human turrets blazed, Vayari warriors roared. Daniel's traps exploded in bright fire, catching raiders off guard. The hidden transport detonated with a thunderous blast, wiping out an entire wave of enemies. Kareth led the charge on the walls, her blade flashing, her growl echoing like a storm. Daniel, instead of hiding, ran between defense points, fixing weapons, rerouting power, and shouting directions. For hours the battle raged. The colony held, but the raiders pressed harder, their numbers endless. The Diwi. Turning point in the middle of the fight, disaster struck. The raiders unleashed their heaviest weapon, a massive siege walker taller than the colony walls, bristling with cannons. Each blast shook the ground, tearing through defenses. Panic spread among the defenders. The walls cracked, and human soldiers began to fall back. Even the Vayari hesitated. Daniel's mind raced. He had seen machines like this before in old records. They were nearly unstoppable. But they had one weakness, the power core inside their chest. If we can overload its core, it'll fall, Daniel shouted. But how? A soldier cried. Daniel looked at Kareth. I need to get inside that thing. Kareth growled in disbelief. You will die. Maybe, Daniel said, gripping his toolbox. But if we don't stop it, everyone dies. Kareth's heart pounded. Every instinct told her to drag him back, but his courage burned brighter than fear. Finally, she growled low and steady. Then I go with you. Into the beast, the siege walker crashed through the wall, its cannons tearing the yard apart. Amid the chaos, Daniel and Kareth dashed forward. She cut through raider guards with savage strength while he followed close, carrying a pack of explosives. Together, they reached the walker's legs. Daniel scrambled up the metal, searching for an access hatch. A blast nearly knocked him off, but Kareth caught him, pulling him up with one arm. Hurry, human, she roared. Working on it, Daniel yelled, prying the hatch open with his tools. Sparks flew as he forced the panel loose. Inside, the machine pulsed with energy. The core was there, glowing like a heart of fire. Daniel set the explosives carefully. This will overload the system, but once it goes, we've got seconds to get out. Kareth growled fiercely. Then we make seconds enough. The escape. The explosives armed, Daniel and Kareth climbed down the walker as it staggered, its systems screaming. Alarms blared inside the machine. Run! Daniel shouted. They leapt from the metal giant just as it erupted in a storm of fire. The explosion tore through the battlefield, shaking the ground and lighting the sky. The walker collapsed in ruins, its cannons silenced forever. For a moment, silence fell. Then cheers erupted across the colony. Humans and Vayari roared in triumph. The tide had turned. The raiders, stunned by the loss of their great weapon, began to retreat. One by one, their ships pulled back into the sky, fleeing the battlefield. The colony had won. Aftermath of victory. When the dust settled, The defenders stood among ruins, but alive. The colony was battered, but it still stood. Daniel sat on the broken wall, exhausted, his clothes torn and his hands burned. Kareth stood beside him, her armor cracked, her blade nicked, but her eyes burning with pride. She growled softly, the sound low and steady. Daniel smiled weakly. Still cute. This time she shook her head. No, Daniel, not cute. Strong. My growl is yours now. It means I stand with you. Always. Daniel blinked, his chest tightening. For the first time, he understood fully. Her growl was no longer a warning or a test. It was trust. Loyalty. Something deeper. He reached out and placed his hand gently on hers. Then I'll never stop answering. A new beginning. Days later, the colony began to rebuild again. But now something had changed. Humans and Veyari no longer worked side by side out of necessity. They worked together out of respect. The whispers of doubt about Kareth faded. She was no longer seen as weakened by a human. She was seen as stronger because of him. Daniel became more than just an engineer. He became a symbol, a reminder that strength took many forms. And Kareth, once feared only for her blade and her growl, became something greater. She was the warrior who had trusted a human, and through that trust, saved them all. The last growl one evening, long after the colony was safe, Daniel and Kareth stood on the wall together. The stars glittered above, quiet and endless. Kareth growled softly, almost like a purr. Daniel smiled. Still cute. Kareth chuckled, shaking her head. Strange human. One day, you will learn that my growl is not about being cute. Maybe, Daniel said with a grin, but I'll always hear it that way, because it means you're here. For a long moment they stood in silence. The war was behind them, but their story was not finished. Wherever the frontier took them, they would face it together, one human, one Veyari, and a growl that had changed everything.